The tyranny of life milestones. There's lots of pressures to live up to certain life achievements on a strict timeline. Those milestones are often arbitrary and way more harmful than we realize. Michael Singh is on track. At 30, he's finishing up his residency in ophthalmology at Massachusetts Eye and Ear Specialty Hospital in Boston, looking forward to starting his fellowship year and thinking about marrying his girlfriend in the next couple of years. This is just how we had envisioned things would go. My personal goal was to be married or engaged by the time I was finishing my residency, he says. These goals didn't match up to any intrinsic logic or biological necessity. I don't know why, it just seemed like the right sort of time frame, he says. When he looked around at what everyone else was doing, it seemed like they were getting married in their late 20s or early 30s, so he matched up his expectation and plans to follow suit. Plus, his grandparents kept teasing him to get married before they die. But Singh wasn't always so sure that life would go according to plan. While his friends started to get serious with their significant others right after college, he was single, wondering when he was going to find his person. He stressed over getting into the right medical school, then winning a good residency. Life felt uncertain, and as he waited and waited to meet her right partner, he worried that he was falling behind. Every society has a few important life milestones, and those achievements are often tied to a specific timeline. For instance, Western societies prioritize moments like graduating from college at 22, getting married by 30, having kids and buying a house before 35. We mark success by ticking off the boxes and worrying that missing a deadline means we are falling in our lives or careers. But where do those metrics come from? As it turns out, these all-important deadlines are often arbitrary, and the pressure to achieve them sometimes comes from amorphous, unidentifiable places. They also aren't as set in stone as they may seem. From generation to generation, changes in technology and the economy, advances in science, and even the political climate can turn what once seemed like social necessity into an antiquated expectation. Understanding where these expectations come from and how they differ from the reality we live in now is important for making personal milestones that are meaningful instead of clinging to outdated expectations. The mystery of social norms. From the moment humans pop out of the womb, we are ready to learn. We pick up the language around us and learn the rules of our society, what behavior is allowed, what's considered good or bad. We are absolutely built that way, to learn norms and to comply with them, says Jeffrey Arnott, a senior research scholar at Clark University in Massachusetts who studied emerging adulthood. For the most part, we do what's expected of us. How these norms get set is a combination of social, economic, and technological factors. These things develop and we are all aware of them and we all follow them, but nobody determines them, says Arnott. It's this aggregation of millions of people thinking about things and making decisions and talking to each other. Nobody's really in control of it. Among these influences, parents and families play a huge role, especially around expectation for timing around marriage and kids. For instance, most baby boomers in Western societies generally married in their 20s, bought a house and had kids soon after. Subsequently, they transferred this expectation and that timeline to their millennial children. But millennials but millennials in the US and the UK aren't hitting those milestones. Instead, they are getting on married an average of 7 years later than their parents and haven't married at all. And the age women first give birth has consistently risen over the past 40 years. So most millennial women are having children later than their baby boomer parents, waiting until age 29 or older. Similarly, The home ownership rate for millennials is 8% lower than it was for the preceding two generations. That's because parents aren't the only factors that influence the milestones, and millennials were born into a very different world than the one their parents knew and navigate in a very different way. Millennials are, on average, better educated than previous generations. Nearly 40% in the US have a bachelor's degree compared to only a quarter of baby boomers. That means they are entering the workforce later, so they start saving for homes later too. We certainly realize more and more the importance of education and training, says Arnett. That means you are not likely to be self-sufficient at 19 or 20. Debt for financing college, along with rising home costs, also mean that fewer millennials can afford to buy homes. And although expectations that women get married and have kids haven't changed, ideas about gender norms have shifted. There was a lot of pressure of women to find a man and get married, says Arnett. If you didn't, what else were you going to do? But now it's much more common for women to pursue education and careers. Since the mid-1990s, more women have attended university than men. So while in 1966 only 40% of women aged 22 to 37 were employed, in 2020 72% of millennial women were participating in the workforce. That interest in education and career has changed when women have kids. A New York Times analysis shows that women with college degrees have children an average of 7 years later than women who don't go to college, and that education level was a greater factor in delaying having kids than other factors like home prices. Advances in science and technology also have had huge impact on these expectations. Take the example of birth control, which allowed women to start being sexually active years before they plan to marry or having children. That gives people so much more decision-making power over whether to enter marriage or parenthood, says Arnett. That is truly revolutionary. Right now, it is considered fairly normal to start exploring sexuality perhaps a decade before marriage, something he notes was unprecedented before the later half of the 20th century. But while economic and educational realities have changed drastically, our social expectations haven't kept pace. One survey by the US Census Bureau showed that the majority of Americans believe people should be economically independent by age 21. But the same survey also found that the majority of the country didn't think most students would be done with college until age 22. This contradiction sets people up to fail milestones even as they work desperately to achieve them. The tyranny of the should. Newer generations are feeling the stress. They still feel the pressure to live up their parents' and grandparents' norms, even if those expectations really aren't relevant anymore. One survey showed that, on average, adults older than 25 still plan to get married, having kids and buy a home all before age 30, even though the number of people actually able to do so has decreased with every generation. The gap between what recent generations think they ought to be achieving and what is possible in today's financial and educational climate is having a massive impact on their mental health. In general, greater discrepancy between what people want and what they actually do reliably predict poorer health and well-being, wrote the survey's author. The researchers also suggest that the increasing inability to reach major life milestones in the time frame we set for ourselves may be one explanation for the rise in deaths of despair, drug overdose, and suicides caused by financing job and bleak economic outlook. Charlotte Housden, an occupational psychologist based in Kent, UK, calls the social pressure of the tyranny of the shield. She counsels people who are feeling stressed that they are falling behind to remember that they aren't alone. Lots of people struggle with the misconception that they aren't measuring up society standards. She says people tend to make big globalized exaggerations like everyone is getting married or everyone has more money than I do. But that's not true. It's a thinking error, she said. Some people have more money, some people are getting married. And she wants that achieving these goals, either by getting a high-paying job or buying a nice home, won't necessarily making you happy. It's about finding your fit, she says. Houston recommends taking a moment to separate what it is and what you really want and what it is that you feel your parent or family expect. Understand where your drivers are coming from, she says. Is it you that wants to go to college or is it your parents? Is it something you really want? Houston emphasizes focusing on achievements that makes you happy rather than achievements that conform to parental or social expectations. But she acknowledges that that's easier said than done. Singh spent much of his mid-twenties thinking he had fallen hopelessly behind his friends, but as he aged, he started to gain more confidence in his own path. I didn't I hadn't met anybody that I wanted to start my life with, and that was okay, he says. I was putting in the work and becoming the person I wanted to become. He was lucky to enjoy what he calls Indian boy privilege, which gave him a break from the family pressure to get married. Because many of his friends also pursued graduate and professional degrees, he didn't feel self-conscious about being in school for so long and delaying certain milestones like buying homes or having kids. But he acknowledged that he wouldn't feel so confident and laid back now if he hadn't found his girlfriend and started getting life to conform to the milestone he set. I think it would be a lot harder for me to feel satisfied, he said. Singh's path took longer than he expected, but there is evidence that these ideas about when we should settle down and have kids are starting to change. The US Census survey also showed that the vast majority of Americans believing that finishing schools and getting a job are important markers of adulthood, more so than getting married or having kids. There's less judgment about living with parents for a period of time after college, and more emphasis on education and financial security. So, where these expectations seem fixed and finite, the truth is that they're changing all the time, even if you may not think so.